All right, I think we should get started. What do you think, Josh?
Let's do it. I'm
All
excited.
right. Hopefully everyone's energized. It's day 2 and it's the afternoon, and if I'm not mistaken, we're all kind of coming off lunch. But let's hope the audience is energized. So we're glad to have you here, and we're doing our first kind of team presentation, Josh and I. But I'm going to turn it over and let Josh kick it off. I believe, right?
I mean, I'm happy to kick it off. Hey, everybody. I'm Josh Sokol. I am here to talk to you guys today, along with my buddy John, about the Security Practitioner's Guide to Going from No to Whoa. And the whole idea of this presentation was we're going from no because you're not on the same page to whoa, where we're starting to talk with management and they're actually understanding what we're saying. Leadership is constantly telling us no as security practitioners, but it's because you aren't communicating in their language, which is the language of business. And security issues are often seen by practitioners as binary. Is it an emergency? Will it happen? Won't it happen? That kind of thing. And so the idea behind this presentation, what John and I are going to talk to you guys today, is how do we go from that state where, hey, we're being told no all the time, to a state where management actually looks at what we're doing as a value add to the business, and we're in a much better position as security practitioners because they're actually listening to what we have to say.
That's right. And to get started, I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is John Overbaugh. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Alpine Software Group. We're sort of a private equity company that purchases and runs a number of companies in different verticals. I've been in information security since 2012, most of that time in healthcare, and really have had a lot of opportunity to learn how to social engineer leadership. And that essentially is what we're going to talk about today.
Awesome. And I'm Josh Sokol. I'm used to run the information security program for a big $1.6 billion a year publicly traded organization called National Instruments. I did that for about a decade. And then eventually I moved into a role as CEO and CISO as Simplorus. Simplorus is a free open source enterprise risk management tool. When I was working at NI, my VP came to me one day and she said, Josh, I heard about this risk management thing. Can you figure it out for me? I said, yeah, I can do that. I did a lot of research. I came across the NIST 800-30 framework for risk management. I said, this is what I want my program to look like. But the piece I struggled with was the tool set. I started off using Excel spreadsheets, quickly realized that they wouldn't scale. I used a homegrown Lotus Notes database for a little bit and wasn't dynamic enough. And then I started looking at the big GRC suites that are out there. Eventually, I got to the point where I couldn't afford the big GRC suites. The Excel stuff wasn't going to scale for me. And so I ended up writing something. I ended up releasing that thing that I wrote free and open source to the security community, and that is Simplorus. So today we're going to talk to you guys a little bit more about kind of what goes on behind the scenes there. We'll talk about the management stuff and whatnot. But before we get into that, let's talk about the Atlas syndrome. The Atlas syndrome is the no. It's the idea that we are putting all this weight on our shoulders. So take a moment. Think about all the security tools that are currently sitting in your arsenal, all the different things that are out there. How many are there? 5, 10? Is there more than that? Once you have that number in your head, I want you guys to think about the alerts, the things like that are coming from your NGAV, the EDR, the firewalls, the SIEM, right? Now, in terms of those alerts, SC Media did a survey back in 2018, and they said that 55% of enterprises see more than 10,000 alerts per day, and 27% saw more than 1 million alerts per day. That's a crazy number when you start to think of it. And maybe you guys are seeing that same kind of thing. And Demisto in 2018 did a state of SOAR report where they said security teams were bombarded with 107. There we go. Sorry, I was getting a different presentation coming in over me. I was like, this is super weird. And then I just closed the browser. That SOAR report basically said that security teams were bombarded with 174,000 alerts per week, an average of about 25,000 per day. So regardless of the source, we know that our security teams are up against a constant barrage of alerts. Now, since we know about all these different alerts, when I was at NI, we had about 100,000 vulnerabilities that were found by our scan. And all those different vulnerabilities that were found were waiting to be triaged. So if you think about it, this was me. Every platform that alerted, every vulnerability that was found, these were my burdens to bear. And in short, this was me. I'd have panic attacks thinking about all the what if scenarios. I sometimes had trouble sleeping at night thinking about which would be the nail in my coffin. Can any of you guys relate to this? John, do you relate to this?
Absolutely. I mean, Josh, having been in information security for over 10 years now, this is what we deal with day in and day out, is that heavy weight on our shoulders of knowing everything that's going wrong, knowing where all the skeletons are, knowing what's going bump in the night. And it literally can be physically taxing, like no joke. But also it's something that hampers us in our performance and our professional advancement and the success that we have in work if we don't figure out how to manage it and get through it.
Absolutely. Now, I'm guessing the rest of you guys feel that same way as well. And what we're going to talk about today is kind of what do we do about that. John's going to cover that a little bit more. The other issue that we run into, the thing that we see very frequently, is what we call the chicken little effect. And we see practitioners going this route all the time. The idea here is that with every new issue discovered, the sky is falling, right? Every issue that we find is the worst issue possible. There's no prioritization. There's no way to discern which thing is the most important thing to work on, and ends up becoming a constant distraction from work which pays the bills, right? And that's a big issue there. So what happens? All right, well, what if I told you that eventually management is going to start to ignore you? You're going to get used to hearing the word no, right? Over and over again, because you're now you're being seen as an inhibitor to the business. So this is your last chance. After this, there's no turning back. You can take this blue pill and the story ends. You guys can go back to work. You can continue to feel like Atlas. You can bemoan your fellow security practitioners about how you're constantly being told no. Or you can take the red pill. You can stay in Wonderland. John and I are going to show you how deep this rabbit hole goes. And remember, what we're offering here is the truth and nothing more, right? Very matrixy, but you get the idea. You can pick that red pill. You're going to go back to the same old way, the same binary approach, the same Atlas syndrome, or you can listen to us and find a new way to approach it, which is the non-binary way. And so I'm going to let John kind of take it from here.
Sure thing. Thanks, Josh. So we're presenting an alternative approach instead of the Chicken Little Atlas syndrome approach. We're presenting a new approach to information security management. The foundation of that is an entirely new perspective that security leadership's responsibility really is to define, assess, and contextualize while reporting. So the key here is that we have to understand our role as security practitioners. And most important in understanding that role is that we are not the risk owners. We are risk discoverers, and we help teams to understand and respond to or treat that risk. So let's jump ahead one more slide here, and we want to talk about how we do that. Well, look, our companies trust us to conduct risk assessments, or maybe the better word is they entrust us to conduct risk assessments. We start by proposing and working for agreement on a list of controls or on a control framework. And then we analyze against those frameworks. When we're there to serve the business and to support them in improving security by helping them ensure they're adhering and are compliant to those frameworks. To accomplish all of this, our program has to be written down and approved by senior management.
Now, there's an interesting kind of side conversation that you and I had here, John, which is this idea of auditors, right? That now that we've got our framework, the auditors are going to come in, they're going to say, hey, these are the things that you should do. And I had this happen to me when I was at NI, where they said, hey, here's the checklist. Do you do this? And I'd say, yes, check that off. And then they'd say, do you do this? And I'd be like, no. And they'd check that off, right? Yeah. And I ended up writing a blog post about this that called Auditors Don't Understand Security. The whole idea is that this checklist approach to risk management just doesn't work, right? The idea of risk assessment via a checklist. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a good question. I want to actually drill down a little further into this risk management framework and talk more about it. And by the way, this risk management framework should not be new to anyone. This is what we do all day long. And it's a more visual way of looking at what we do as leaders. We run parts of the company through a traditional risk management framework or a process. What's important in all of this is the new phase I've added on there, the document phase, right? It's important to provide a clear definition of done for a given control. Otherwise, the business runs out of patience with us, or because the definition of done is not clear, they always say, yeah, we've got that. We've got that. So our program can either be unclear and frustrating to our business customers, or our program can be ineffective, a paper tiger at best. So by having this solid framework where we document our controls and then we assess, prioritize, plan, and track to remediation vulnerabilities, this is a better approach to completing that cycle. Now, Josh, I want you to tell me a little story about the last time you did a road mapping exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. So, back when I worked at National Instruments, my management kept coming to me and they said, Josh, when is this going to be done? When are you done? When does security stop? And, the funny thing about this is we all know as security practitioners, it never stops, right? There's always, the goalposts are constantly moving because our threats, our adversaries are constantly changing their approach. So I did this exercise. I took the NIST cybersecurity framework and went through it. And for each individual item in there, I said, this is where we're at today. And this is where I want to get to. Basically, an assessment of our state. And what we looked at for that was the difference between that. If there was a big gap, that's a big risk. If it's a small gap, it's a small risk. But at the end of the day, we were able to basically take this exercise that we did and turn it into a roadmap for our organization. We could say that, hey, if I bridge this gap, now we're in the place that we need to be in order to move our organization forward.
And the key is to get to that bar, Josh, like you said, right? So there's an assessment of where we are today versus where we want to be. And what's important is making sure that senior management is on board with where we want to be. Once we have agreement there, then we can define those gaps. We're not the owners of those gaps. We're not the bad guys that are bringing bad news. Our job is to observe. And we can now answer that question, when does this stop? Well, it stops when we meet the bar that was set by leadership, which leadership approved. Then we go to work on it. Now, the key is that we work with leadership. We start, because we're security experts, we're the ones that really know what the right controls are. So we'll sit down, come up with those controls, propose them to senior leadership, help them understand the pros and cons of either meeting or deviating from that particular control, and eventually we reach that conclusion. So part of our job here is to build consensus. Now, go ahead, Josh. Do you have something you want to say? Add to that?
I was just going to say, one thing that I wanted to key in on there is what you said. This is a proposal. We're telling management, this is what we'd like to see, but we're not deciding. As security practitioners, we're not the decision makers because we don't own the people, the budget, things like that.
Yep. That's right. Yeah. As a CISO, for instance, my job is very different from what it was, 10 years ago as a director of security. Today, my job is to sit with senior leaders in the company and talk from a strategic perspective about risk, talk about what the appropriate control frameworks might look like, and talk about the business problems that we're facing that might prevent us from implementing those. So it is very much a conversation that we have to have at the leadership level. Now, Josh, I get asked a lot, either within my organizations, but often outside of organizations. By the way, I'm really active on LinkedIn. You can follow me there or connect with me. I'm also pretty active on Reddit, a little more anonymously, but still same idea. I talk a lot about leadership and about security. And one of the controversial things I always tell people is, I don't care if you have policies or procedures in place. I want to see an incident response plan first. And there are a lot of people who say, no, you can't do that. You have to have a policy to dictate your procedure or you can't move forward, right? So some people really assert that we have to have policy and procedure first. Others say we have to have controls. And it's an age-old argument. But what's interesting about this argument is it's actually a trick question, right? We need policy and procedure. We need controls pretty much at the same time. If you want to pop to the next slide, Josh, pretty much at the same time. And as we develop one, it will feed off the other, and we'll be going back and forth. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead one, didn't I? We'll be flipping back and forth. So, just in this approach where we're talking about, we want to go to senior leadership with a control set. Well, we have to have a policy first. They're going to inform one another. You're going to write these together if they don't exist today. You're going to modify them together if they are in place today. That's the important thing. So both of them come first. And so the real question here is, what is our responsibility? So really, to summarize what we're talking about, senior leadership's responsibility rests in identifying and communicating where the risk is. That is what a strong risk management program does. And then we define the associated processes to correct that program. How do we track what decisions are being made and who's making these decisions is another thing we need to tackle. When we have that tackled, what we're doing now is we are setting a bar. We're identifying gaps between where we are today and where that bar is. Then we're sharing those gaps with the actual owners of them. And then we're also collecting from them their plan to remediate that. All along, senior management is informed. They understand from a metrics perspective as well as an anecdotal perspective where we stand. The business may start fighting us on this because what we're doing is we're ridding ourselves of the Atlas syndrome. We're taking that big ball of responsibility for the security work, picking it up, dividing it, and placing it on the shoulders of the business owners who have agreed to the controls, but have the control gaps and are responsible for the remediation. By the way, the business might really fight you the first time you try to document their decision not to fix something, but that's okay. Those conversations are what we need to have. And I actually want to talk briefly about that. What if they say no? So I want to put in your mind this idea that we don't have all of the context of what's going on in the business. We don't understand everything around what our executives are making and the issues that they're facing. And honestly, sometimes it's probably better not to know. It's not that leaders don't value security, although I will admit there are some who do not, but rather that in the context of everything else, that information security vulnerability we're talking about, that may not be the priority, right? So for instance, as a startup company, we may be so small and have such small revenue that the decision is either we add new features, gain new revenue, or we go out of business. And we don't really have the luxury of addressing some of that security stuff. We have to take a risk because otherwise we're threatening the very existence of the company. This is where you, as the security leader, really define yourself. You can complain or whine and say, my CISO is an idiot, my CEO is a jerk, whatever you want to say, or you can accept the answer and come up with an alternative that might help compensate or mitigate the risk. And it may not be a full mitigation, but it might help to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. The key takeaway I want you to have here is that no is not a terminus, it's a junction. The successful leaders in business today in information security are those who look at no as an opportunity to get to yes. That is the most important characteristic we can have. Now, we want to be able to take all of this information and bring it together and get to yes on the right things. We want to be able to filter our highest risks to the top so we can have good, effective conversations about those and deal with those sooner. The challenge is, how do we do that? How do we bring all of our risks together? How do we understand what appropriate mitigations are for those risks? How do we document the decisions that we have made? And how do we ensure that senior management is buying off on those decisions and we can literally prove that they made that decision? Well, now we need tools. And as Josh pointed out earlier, probably the tools we have today aren't enough. So Josh, I want you to take a few minutes and talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to tools for risk management, we need good tools that enable information security leadership by creating a strong governance foundation. We need those frameworks that John talked about. We need to develop a strong risk management process, something that's easy to understand, something that's easy to follow. Identifying and communicating this risk is where the strong risk management program, the associated processes come into play. And so this is how we end up getting rid of that Atlas syndrome. Additionally, enforcing separate roles for risk assessment, conveyance, and acceptance. And then, lastly, enabling the business to make informed risk-based decisions. And that really is going to be the key thing here. Our business is the ones making the decisions. And that's going to be a theme kind of throughout this presentation. Now, have you guys ever seen a spreadsheet like this?
These are my favorite.
I love yeah. I mean, I lived these when I was at NI. I've seen dozens of templates like this online. If you search risk management template, this is what you come back with. And so, I've lived this. The issue with templates, though, or spreadsheets, is this. You can try doing risk management in Excel. It's generally available to you. There's no additional cost. But it comes with a lot of challenges. The first one here is spreadsheets don't scale. You have a spreadsheet with a dozen risks for a single team, it might be manageable. But one with hundreds or thousands of risks across multiple teams, it just becomes unwieldy. Having multiple people editing the same spreadsheet at the same time, that's a recipe for disaster. And worse, how do you maintain an enterprise approach to risk management while ensuring that one team doesn't see another team's risk? The second one here is a spreadsheet just isn't a database, right? You can do pivot tables in Excel, you can use fancy formulas, but joining data from distinct tables is difficult, if not impossible, to do in an Excel spreadsheet. Uh, in something like Simplest, database queries can sometimes span a dozen or more tables, which takes a fraction of a second when it comes to a database. There's simply no substitute for the efficiency and scale of a database when you're joining multiple distinct sets of data. And then the last one here, spreadsheets require maintenance. Anybody who tells you otherwise is just flat out wrong, or they haven't used a spreadsheet. Those who fall into this spreadsheet-based risk approach to risk management, they'll typically spend just as much time tweaking their spreadsheet and messing around with their formulas as they do actually managing risk. And remember, again, I started out doing risk management with spreadsheets, right? I've been there. Each new report is going to require a substantial investment of time to create, and it really just ends up being a waste of resources that are far better utilized elsewhere in your organization. Now, once I realized that my spreadsheets wouldn't work, I used a homegrown Lotus Notes database to do risk management. You can do this. You can do a DIY approach, try and write yourself. You end up spending countless wasted hours on development instead of doing risk management, which is what we're trying to do. And when the reality is that most of us, risk management is this much of our overall responsibility, and we've got so much else on our plate. If you're spending that time trying to write a tool, maybe it's not spent in the best place. And especially if you're not a developer, man, you got problems there. So yeah, John, tell us about the ideal solution.
Well, so what's interesting is the first half of my career I spent in product groups building software at Microsoft, and was very familiar with the tools that we used internally to identify, track, and remediate bugs, defects in our software. Then, fast forward, I'm in information security, and both as a practitioner, as a director, over multiple groups, and then also as a consultant with numerous customers. All I had at my hands was an Excel spreadsheet. And, I just didn't have the tool set that I needed to get the job done. I needed to be just as effective at managing thousands of risks across multiple teams as I would be with 10 risks. I also needed to allow multiple people to work in my solution. And in fact, my first role as a vice president, as a VP, I had 7 members on my team, and they were all responsible for identifying risks. And the spreadsheets that we had just weren't keeping up with it. Finally, I needed to be able to report easily across multiple data sets for different customers. And I needed to be able to spend my time working on risk, not on the tool. I like to tell my teams all the time that, look, the tool is there for us. We're not there for the tool. And so, and we don't want this to sound like it's a sales pitch, but I was thrilled to come across Simple Risk. So as Josh mentioned, I started looking for risk management, GRC tools, GRC solutions. They're very high priced. They take a long time to stand up, and they require a pretty heavy commitment. We, on one of my teams, stumbled across Simple Risk, and I thought it might be too good to be true. So first of all, it was free and open source if I wanted. There was also a paid commercial version of it. And so, what really helped me was finding this solution, playing with a little bit, just doing some scenarios and realizing, holy cow, I can bring all my risks in one place. I can start to propose solutions to those risks. I can track agreement on whether or not the solutions will be accepted, and I can track that risk to completion. So today what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the risk management process. We're actually going to do it real time. We're going to use Simple Risk, not because we're trying to sell it to you, it's free, but because it does a great job of demonstrating all of the phases of risk management. And again, in the end, what we're trying to do here is take responsibility for fixing vulnerabilities off of our shoulders and placing it upon the shoulders of the business owners, the people who actually can fix the risk. So let's dive in here, Josh, and let's walk through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first piece that we talked about was creating this strong governance foundation through the control frameworks. And even in Simplest Core, there's kind of 2 different ways to go about doing this. You can manually add your own frameworks, manually add your controls into there. But my personal preference is leveraging what's called the Compliance Forge Secure Controls Framework. This is a free thing. You can download from securecontrolsframework.com. They'll give it to you as an Excel spreadsheet. But what they've done is they've taken about 1,000 security and privacy related controls, and they mapped them across 185 different frameworks. So things like NIST, ISO, PCI DSS, HIPAA, GDPR, kind of you name it, all these different frameworks are all mapped into here. And what you end up getting with this is kind of this, if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, like the one ring to rule them all approach. You basically have like this one control set, but it applies across the board. And the huge advantage to this is when it comes to your compliance, when it comes to actually testing these controls, you test the control once and it applies in all those different locations. So that mapping is huge.
Yep. This is what I love, if I can interrupt briefly. This is what I love about having a control set and the ability to map controls to various frameworks. It allows me to customize my controls for my organizations. The company I work for, we own 45 different companies. We have very different security needs at each company. Some of them are in behavioral health, which means they're under the United States HIPAA laws. Some of them are under PCI and other data protection laws. But what's important here is I have a common set of controls mapped to different frameworks. What also helps me is I can map controls to my customer contractual commitments. So Josh, like you said, I may be in a HIPAA regulated environment. I might have 15 customers that give me a very definitive list of security controls that I have to have in place. What I can do is map all of those to my existing control framework. Then I audit once and I can report multiple times.
That's right. Yeah. The other interesting thing here, and this kind of drives back to what we were talking about with the NIST CSF exercise that I did, where I said, here's where I'm at today, here's where I want to get to, is we can use any control framework really to do this same kind of exercise. So we can say, with this example, this is GOVA 1 in Compliance Board, my current level of maturity is performed, my desired state is managed, and so now we have that gap. And within Simporus, we can go, there's a cool report called the Control Gap Analysis Report that I built based on what I presented to my management. And it's going to show me, here's where I'm at today. Here's where I want to get to with each of those different control families. So I can see I'm doing well at asset management. I'm not doing very well at secure engineering and architecture.
And Josh, there's one thing I really like about this graph. And first of all, we're all going to have a little laugh about this, right? Because we all know that executives want pictures. And, I used to joke about it, but actually, honestly, there's no better way to communicate the status of 250 control sets than a graph like this. So the key on this graph is that the black line is the predefined, agreed upon maturity level that we want to reach as a company. We've selected these controls in each of these areas and said, senior leadership says this is where we need to be. The blue line shows where we actually are today. I can put this control down in front of a CEO, and within about 10 seconds, that CEO understands I need to make investments here, and I'm cruising well here.
Yeah. And to put it in the language that you used earlier, it's the bar, right? The black line, the desired state is the bar that we've agreed upon to meet. And so in any of these areas where I'm not meeting that bar, that means that we have some explaining to do. This is what we're going to do to get us to that point.
And when we're not meeting that bar, that's what we call risks. And we want to go through a common risk management framework. And the one that you've developed in Simple Risk is based on the NIST 830 framework. So Josh, why don't you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, the second item that we talked about was developing that strong risk management process. But I think the more important thing here is that it needs to be easy to understand and follow. The reality is that, a lot of the people who are going to be entering risks in your organization, they're not risk practitioners. They're not risk experts. They're the Unix guy who discovered a unencrypted SSH key while messing around on a system, right? Those are the people who are going to be interacting with this. So, the process that NIST gives us is pretty simple. It says, hey, you need to be able to submit your risk. Keep a registry of all the risks in your organization. Talks about plan mitigations. What are we going to do to address these risks? John, you and I had a conversation earlier that maybe we should change that to treatment because we're not necessarily going to mitigate everything, right? We might transfer the risk. We might decide to research or to watch. The next step is the accepting the mitigation. So this is where we start to look at, hey, this person said we should do this. Yeah, that sounds good. Let's go ahead and do that. And then, in my opinion, the most important piece here is going to be the management review. This is the piece that gets the weight of the world off of your shoulders as the security guy. This is where we say, hey, management, here's the risks. These are all the risks in our registry. Here's what we think that we should do about it. Do you agree? Is this the bar that we want to hold ourselves to? And when management says, yes, we should, cool. They are now empowering us to make these changes, right? It might not be us making those changes. It's the business that's doing this. If they say no, we're not willing to do this, then like John talked about earlier, we might lack the context. We don't know that the business has, $1,000 left in the bank and can't make payroll this month, right? There may be some very valid reasons why they're making this decision not to. It's not our place to question that, but it is our place to make sure that that decision is documented, because that's what gets that monkey off of our back. And then the last piece here is the review regularly. So risk management is a cyclical process. We don't just do it once and forget about it. We need to make sure that we're re-reviewing on a regular basis, because frankly, risk changes. You have a CVE that's introduced. Well, let's start off with an O-Day that was introduced a week ago, right? That O-Day is huge. It's somebody's automated, it's compromising systems. All of a sudden, we have a CVE, we have a patch in place, the risk goes down, right? So risk is constantly changing, and we need to reevaluate those risks in order to do that.
Yep. Now, one of the things I love about using a tool like Simple Risk is, let's step back. If you consider tracking risks in Excel, how do you do it? You have an Excel apply, a worksheet in a workbook, and you're going to have columns for title and for owner and so on and so forth. And really not a lot of context to help you fill it out. You could pre-populate some of the columns by using, a pick list and so forth, but that's just work to build the worksheet. So what really has helped kind of move the lever for me in my experience using Simple Risk is that now I can track risks just like I use Jira to track my defects. And that metaphor really, it gels well with our development team. So a very simple risk management workflow is something we have to have. The system has to present it to users in a simple and intuitive way to allow users to submit the risks themselves. And you can see here, this tab that we're showing is how I collect data about the risks across my 45 companies. I allow those individuals and those companies to create those risks. What's really nice about this is that there's a framework in here for rating your risk. And you can use any framework you're comfortable with. If it's DREAD, if it's STRIDE, if it's the common, impact times likelihood, if it's the OWASP risk score, if it's the CVSS, you can pick whatever you want to do, put it in here. And as Josh is going to demonstrate in just a second, that risk score is normalized across all risks. No matter how the score has been entered, it's the same score across all risks, which allow you to compare risks with one another. So Josh, why don't you take that tab and talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the idea is that we're able to go and we're able to say, hey, if this is the likelihood of an issue and this is the impact, here's the risk score. So we can use that kind of classic risk methodology that you learned on your CISSP. But as John said, you've got things like OWASP risk rate methodology. So if you find a SQL injection vulnerability, you might want to capture it that way. If you find the latest log4shell vulnerability, you might go for a CVSS score because that's a CVE that you can capture. So really, this is just a matter of documenting the decisions that we're making and the process that we use to get to that point. Now,
okay, but Josh, I'm going to interrupt.
All right.
This is not a 10.
All right. Fair enough, John. This is
how many times do I have to tell you? Not every risk is a 10.
Well, you've told me enough times for me to know better for sure. You're absolutely right. So this risk right here, it says that it's a 10. But the interesting thing is that a 10 it's subjective, right? If I am the information security person and this is a risk that a system's going to get compromised in my world, within my purview, that's a 10. Right? But as soon as we go outside of my purview, now we're talking IT. Is that still a 10? That one system getting compromised, is that still a 10? Probably not. When we're talking in the IT realm of things, it's probably my data center is offline. That's probably a 10 in the IT world. Okay, but let's take a step back and let's say, all right, for the enterprise, is the data center going offline? Is that the 10? Or is it the fact that we've lost all of our customers? Is that the real 10? Or the fact that an employee died, right? Is that the 10? So
Right.
when we're looking at these risks, you're absolutely right, John. We have to keep the context in mind, and we
Hmm.
have to kind of baseline this and say, is this a 10 for me, or is this the 10 for the enterprise?
And that's what's nice about the way we can enter risks and modify them in Simple Risk or any other good GRC tool for that matter. They can be entered by someone and we can triage them and sort of override that and record our decision. So every time I tweak a risk, I will document it in a notes field. So what's interesting here is let's assume we've generated the risk, we've created it, somehow we agree it really is a 10. We have the opportunity now to talk about treatment. How are we going to deal with this risk? And we all know that there's a standard formula, right? There's like 5 things we do. We can accept it. We can transfer it with insurance. We can fix it. We can, what else can we do? We can reject it by just turning that
Yep.
system off. Lots of different options. We can capture those as a proposal here in Simple Risk.
Yeah. And so this is the mitigation page, right? This is where we are deciding here's what we're going to do next. What does that
Mm-hmm.
strategy look like? Do I accept, transfer, whatever? But probably more importantly is we're deciding what we're going to do here. So you
Yeah.
look at the current solution, this is where we're at today. This is what we're doing. There may be some controls in place right now. We start to look at the requirements. These are the things we have to do, and then the recommendations. These are probably the things that we should do. And
This
then you'll
is
notice,
just really quick, Josh,
yeah,
this is the definition of done. So
yeah,
I won't let a risk owner review a risk, or I want to let a risk get to a risk owner without defining the definition of done for them. So it's very, very clear what they have to do to fix this risk.
yeah, it's the bar. It's when we meet this bar, we can
Mhm.
say that we're good here. We've achieved that level. And kind of to that point, you have that mitigating controls along the bottom there where I can say, hey, these are the controls we need to have in place in order to
Yep.
fully mitigate this risk.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now,
Now,
next, do you want me to take this? Sorry.
yeah, go for it. Go for
Okay,
it.
I'll take this one. So next step that happens, we've found a risk, we've come up with a proposed mitigation or a proposed treatment for the risk. Now what we do is we take this to senior management and we perform a review. Senior management sits down, generally, maybe not at the risk committee level, but at the risk, whoever on the senior leadership team owns risks. In some cases, that might be the CISO. If the CISO is dialed in enough to business challenges and solutions, they may be the one making those decisions. But regardless, we sit down with them and we go through these risks. And that senior leader has the opportunity to say yes or no. This is what I want to do. I don't want to do this, and so forth. And we capture it on record. And what's neat is a good flexible risk system is flexible enough to allow different individuals to capture and go on record for how they're going to handle different risks based primarily on the risk and the impact to the company. So Josh, do you want to show us that?
Yeah. So when I was at National Instruments, one of the things that I started looking at was the risks in my organization. I started to get this kind of registry of all the different risks out there. And it
Mm-hmm.
looked kind of like this. It was a pyramid. And I had a lot of stuff on the bottom and I had
Mm-hmm.
not so much stuff on the top.
Right.
And most of your risks are going to look something like this for most of our organizations. Well, I
Yep.
started thinking about this. And the other thing that looked like a pyramid was my management. I
Oh,
had, my
interesting.
CEO and then my presidents and my VPs and whatnot. And
Yep.
so when I started looking at how to kind of put my program together, well, what I said was, all right, why don't I say that my managers, they have the ability to review the insignificant and low level risks. These are things
Mm-hmm.
that they have the money, the people to be able to address within their purview. And then I started
Yep.
looking at the section managers and I said, hey, you guys, you'll do medium level risk because you have a little bit bigger budget and more personnel. And then the VPs, or the directors, they would do the high level risk. My VP, she would do the very high level risk. And so
Mm-hmm.
what I found was I could build the visibility and the accountability into the chain of management. I could basically
Right.
assign the review of the different risk levels based on where you were in the management chain.
Mm-hmm.
And it ended up being hugely effective. Now, there's going to be permissions for other things in here too. We can decide who can create risks, who can modify risks, things like that. We can determine who can plan mitigations, who can accept them, and things like that. So lots of permissions need to be built into the system. And this is where we start moving light years away from our spreadsheets because we couldn't do this at all when it came to the spreadsheet.
Yep. I mean, it mirrors another business process, which is the budget approval process, right? Low
Yeah.
level managers can approve so much spend, medium level managers so much spend, so on and so forth. Same thing around risk. Lower level managers are allowed to take a certain amount of risk on, and as you move up the seniority chain, you are allowed to, or welcome to, or invited to, or responsible to take on more risk.
Yeah. So let's take a second and let's move on and let's talk about the informed decision making. How do we actually decide which risks we're going to fix, which risks we're going to ignore for the time being? And the answer is reporting. And this again is getting away from those spreadsheets. We need to enable the business to make those informed risk-based decisions. And there's a few different ways that we can kind of do that. Traditionally, we look at the highest level risks in the organization. We point to that thing that's the very worst thing in our organization, and we say that's the thing I should fix first. And without any other context, that may very well be the case. But when you start to pull in the context piece, you may realize that that might not be the most important thing, or it might be not be the one to fix first. Maybe the level of effort is, it's going to cost us $1 million to fix a risk that might cost us $500,000. Should we fix that risk? Probably not, right? But we need that context. Now, the other thing that we can do is we can look at the level of appetite. So every organization, your level of appetite is going to be completely different. And you'll say, hey, usually when you start, you're going to be like, well, we got a lot of tanks, right? So my level of appetite is going to be really, really high because I just don't have the time to deal with anything that's underneath that. And
hey,
so
Josh, let me just interject really quickly here. Level of appetite or risk appetite here is the level of risk you're comfortable operating in.
That's so, right. Risk tolerance.
Like your risk tolerance. If there's a 1, most of us don't care about the 1s, right? They're just sort of annoying gnats. 10s, like those are the rhinoceroses that are tromping through our camp. So companies generally are somewhere in between a 1 and a 10 in their risk appetite. And as Josh is indicating, that will change over time as well. But I just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, when we're making our decisions, we're probably, if we're using this kind of higher level risk, we're going to start off looking at those really big ones, and then we'll work our way down. So your appetite will actually change over time. It's going to start off being super high, but as you start to eliminate a lot of the high level stuff, your appetite is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller because you've actually fixed a lot of these issues. Now, the other thing that we can do here is we can look at that level of effort. Now, this is when we start to look at context. And so we can look at the mitigation. If we said the mitigation for this is trivial, but it's a 10 risk score, that's my low-hanging fruit. That's the thing that I should attack first because that's where I'm going to get the most bang for my buck. Whereas, if I have something that's going to be a significant amount of effort, but is, a 1-level risk, I probably should save that one towards the end. Now, the other thing that we can do here is we can look at the controls. We talked about the controls. And so when we're making decisions, we can look at this control and we can say, all right, look at all of the risks that are tied to this particular control. There's a lot of risks here. If this control fails for any reason, what does my organization look like now? And now we can start to talk about defense in depth. Should I add an additional control in place? Because, if this control fails, I don't have anything to compensate for that. And so this can help us to identify where those gaps may be or where we're relying too heavily on a single point of failure.
The key here is that there is flexibility in how we present and analyze our risk through different pivots, right? Pivoting off controls, pivoting off cost, pivoting off overall risk and appetite and so forth. So that flexibility allows us to do a couple of things. Number one, we can examine things in different ways and derive kind of a consensus opinion based on those multiple approaches. Number two, we may have a leader who has a specific agenda or specific responsibilities, and we want to pivot and show them risks related to their responsibility. So that flexibility is key and critical for us in that risk management discussion. So look, I want to step back here and just kind of wrap up where we've been and what we've done. So we started out talking about the Atlas syndrome, right? Carrying the weight on our shoulders because we have these lists on our desktop full of risks. We know so much about this organization, it's overwhelming. And we've talked about now how to move that conversation from, oh my gosh, this patch isn't in place, we've got to stop everything and do it. We want to move our conversation from that to a conversation about risk and talk about risk in terms of relative risk, business risk, and risk ownership. When we make this adjustment, right? So again, we've eschewed the blue pill and we've taken the red pill. We're changing the way we talk. No longer are we speaking binary. We're speaking on a scale of 1 to 10, and we're speaking about the actual owners of the risk. Now We give management the context it needs to make informed decisions about treating risk, and we have a platform to communicate it across the business. This is revolutionary because, for me, I started my career with fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and it got me so far, not very far, but it got me so far. I had a few things fixed. But what was interesting is I kept uncovering more stuff. And eventually I asked myself, what's the definition of done here? And realized the approach I was taking, I was burning, I only had a few tickets here to share, and I was burning them pretty quickly. And so I knew I had to change what I was doing. And that's where I stopped, dropped back, and started to look at more of a risk-based formula and more of an indexed approach. By tackling this approach, the other thing that I was able to do was finally put responsibility for risk where it belongs. If I don't own the tool, if I can't deploy the patch myself, I don't own the risk. And I need to find a way to communicate that as a CISO, but also I needed that as a director, as a VP, and as a consultant. Ownership of risk is what we're really talking about here. Ownership and relative measuring. And a good, solid GRC solution helps us get there. Now, we've talked a lot about simple risk today, not because it's a sales pitch, but because it's a great tool that really helps us get our job done. I highly recommend you take a look at it. Josh's team has a bunch of videos out there how to use it. But for me, it really was revolutionary. It allowed me to put all my data in one place, pivot on it, and really communicate and assign ownership. So I appreciate Josh and the work that he's done to produce Simple Risk, but I also appreciate the progress that I've made because of my risk-based communication.
Awesome. Well, very cool. So that kind of wraps our presentation for today. We'll go into the chat and see what questions there are. I see one right now from Ricky. So Ricky asked us, in performing remediation and mitigation, why not revisiting the impact and likelihood instead of the percentage? So you absolutely can. When it comes to inherent risk score, you can certainly reevaluate the impact and the likelihood. And we didn't show it in this presentation, but there is a risk scoring history, and the system will track that. So if you actually change the likelihood or the impact of the risk itself, you're going to be able to reflect that. Now, the reason why I went with the mitigation, it's simple. My whole goal when I was designing Simple Risk was simplicity. I wanted to keep in mind that there's a lot of people in my organization that did not understand. They had a mandate to do risk management, but that wasn't their job, right? And so when it came to that, I could be like, hey, when you applied this particular control, how effective was it? And they could go, I feel like it was 20% effective. And I go, boom, 20%, right? That was the kind of approach that I was taking when I went for the mitigation percent. Now, we do have an item on the roadmap to be able to apply likely an impact to the residual risk as well. But honestly, I feel like the fact that you can do that to the inherent risk, or that you can do a mitigation percent, it kind of gives you the same value in a much simpler format. So,
and
Ricky,
Josh, to dogpile on that, I actually do both. So I'll create a risk. Sometimes one of the nice things about Simple Risk is I can actually generate a questionnaire, and when I'm creating the questionnaire, I can tell Simple Risk, if the answer to this question is no, open a risk automatically. So I don't have to sit there and hand type all my risks in. Yeah. But what happens sometimes is, you don't have context. So I just pick, okay, in general, this control is probably a 4 or a 7 or whatever. Once that risk is auto-generated, I will sit down with the risk owner and we'll talk about it and we'll discuss what's really going on. In the risk assessment and notes fields, I'll capture that information, and then I'll probably tweak the risk score. In fact, I spent an hour with the CEO this morning going over that very same exercise where we tweaked risk scores. And then as Josh said, when I throw a control in place, if I haven't completely mitigated the risk, I want to know that. If I've only brought my risk score down by 20%, then my risk may have gone from a 10 to an 8. That's good. There's control in place, but I haven't dealt with it all. So both approaches are necessary. Yeah. And Josh, my screen's a long ways away from me because of the way I set things up. So I'm going to have you read the questions and we can go back and forth answering them.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions right now.
Okay.
I think Ricky's was the last one that was up there. So
all right.
I know we're sitting about 10 seconds behind them. So maybe somebody is thinking of some amazing question to ask. Or maybe, John, you and I were just so good at answering all the questions and anticipating what they would come up with that we don't need to answer anything else.
Yeah, usually silence worries me.
If you want to reach out, you're welcome to reach out. Like John said, he's big on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn as well. feel free to connect with us. We always like having more friends on there. And then if you want to tweet at me, I'm at Josh Sokol. John, you want to give a Twitter shout out as well?
You know, I can never say anything in 100 characters. What is it now? 300 characters. So find me on LinkedIn, John Overbaugh. It's easy to find me. If you want to chat, I like to connect with people. So go ahead and do that. Let's see. Thanks so much. Oh, I wanted a question. Someone ask a question. Like, I got all this time left.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for coming to visit us. We appreciate it. Take care.
Yep. Thank you.